Okay, rebuttal starts off of the dock and then goes on the dock and then goes back off the dock and then back on the dock. So I will move back and forth as that happens as well. It'll start with front lines. So I'll play it and then I'll explain what the front lines actually are and then we'll analyze them together.
AI, they say rule without a criminal when we act on the crime, but becomes linked globally, so it's no true for and the same Trump international. Our evidence is statistical as well, plus the public case economic crimes are forced to be hands. That was all considered one.
Okay, so there's four responses to the impact defense. I think these are all actually a little bit shaky. The first one is there's spillover, right? Which means that this triggers the economic decline here, triggers economic decline elsewhere, i.e., in authoritarian countries. This is one of the problems with, I think, the wording of Armand's original response, which is that it only applies in democratic countries, which I think is false. I think the response applies in all countries, given the warrant story that was given by the neg originally. And so there's a little bit of sneakiness that could happen with the AF later on, where they say actually the argument that we were making does not only apply to democracies, and you've conceded the warrant that applies to your specific warranting. So this response does not necessarily apply to the warrant. The second response that Jason makes is that this assumes that Trump is rational, which is not true. There's not really evidence provided for this, but I mean, fair enough. I don't know that this necessarily is a very big argument. I think that probably like if you compare just like the statement, this assumes Trump is rational to the original warranted response, I think the original warranted response probably wins. Because probably, it doesn't all depend on Trump, and there's other politicians, and also Trump does to some extent care about like the rational politics that get him into power and allow him to keep power. So I'm not super convinced by this, given the absence of a warrant, why he's irrational in this particular way. Um, at least tech over truth, I don't think this is an argument. The third response that Jason gives, if I'm remembering correctly, he said something about um, uh, what did he say? Let's see.
AI, they say rule without a criminal when we act on the crime, but becomes linked globally, so it's no true for and the same Trump international. Our evidence is statistical as well, plus
Our evidence is statistical. Okay. I don't really know what that. I mean, I guess the argument is like we have empirics. You only have theoretical warrants, why our argument is untrue. So if we have warrants and empirics, the empirics become a tiebreaker that prove why the defense is wrong.
public case economic crimes are forced to be hands.
And then the last one is just a re-articulation of the original warrant, which is the public hates economic decline, which forces Trump's hand. The problem with this is like this is clearly not responsive to the defense because the defense says the public hates economic decline, which is why it doesn't force the US's hand because war is not the only way to get out of that. So I think that the fourth one is wrong. The first one doesn't necessarily apply to the warrant. The second one is not really a response. The third one is the best response. So the third one is the one that they have to overcome. That said, I think that like having better logic in front of a lot of tech judges is enough to beat the empiric. Like you could sort of phrase it as an indictment to the empiric as well. Maybe it proves the empiric is correlation and not causation or something. But I don't know because there is like a fundamental problem of causality with every empiric that allows logic to always hypothetically be something that could indict it.
That was all considered one teacher referred over their political analytics on politics first. Nuclear lobby overwhelmed. It is irrelevant and power time. They have conceded all the other links in the politics as well, and the oil lobby still dominate the field regardless.
Okay, so there's kind of three responses-ish, like two and a half responses to the first response about how the nuclear lobby overwhelms. One is like it is irrelevant and power tagged. I don't know why it's irrelevant. I don't know why it's power tagged, but okay. I don't really think this is a response, so maybe I'll count this as half a response. The second one says that what was the second one?
It is irrelevant and power time. They have conceded all the other links in the politics as well.
Oh yeah, there are other links into politics as well. I don't know why this doesn't apply to all of the links into politics. Like yeah, like especially the way it was implicated, right? Like it seems like this argument says the lobby is powerful enough to sway politicians. The internal link in their argument is about politicians in the legislative branch. That like all of their links get to political debates in the legislative branch. So it's unclear why the nuclear lobby being powerful enough, if it is really a powerful response, does not apply to every single one of their links together. So I don't think this is incredibly convincing, but okay, there are other links.
And the oil lobby still dominate the field regardless of whether or not nuclear lobby is increasing now.
This is a pretty good response. The oil lobby still dominates regardless of whether the nuclear lobby is increasing. Like this is a trend, but it doesn't apply in this specific scenario where the oil lobby, or I guess the gas lobby, right, according to their evidence, still dominates. So they still retain a link on the gas lobby controlling more of the Republican backlash than the nuclear lobby.
People, they say there's no backlash, but they're at its only ISIS 3 oil companies. You can quantify the answers above, those will apply. The third point. lobby. They say there are numerous.
Okay, again, the oil lobby is still quite good, and their evidence is not that great on the oil stuff. I think this is like an okay response. I think that the problem is that the evidence that Plano read was something that could happen post-AF, which is that they could diversify, which means that none of the oil companies hypothetically have a reason to fight back against the nuclear lobby. Jason cross-applied this argument that said the oil lobby is still strong, but that isn't responsive to the argument that Plano was reading, which says even if the oil lobby is strong, they don't have a reason to use their strength against nuclear because nuclear can also help the same companies that make oil because they can diversify into things like fusion, which means I think that this one is completely mishandled.
There are a snapshot, which already said that it's not just more recent. It says that Plutonium will successfully decrease the deficit, which is
Okay, this is, I think, kind of a brazen cross-application of the uniqueness evidence from the neg on politics against the uniqueness evidence on the AF against politics. So the AF says we have evidence that says Republicans are fractured and they're probably not going to agree on the budget reconciliation. The neg says, okay, but our evidence is better. It indicts your evidence, maybe, and it says that they are working together. They're working through issues now. Problem is, it doesn't really say that they're working through issues now. It says they need to work through issues now. And it just is one guy who says it is more likely to work than not, which I think is actually worse evidence than the pretty good warrants that the AF is presenting that are framed as indicting the warrants in the neg evidence. So I'm not really convinced by this cross application.
resolve taxes for all evidence says they are working through issues which years have passed before Memorial Day. Trump has the party in law. This was all card evidence. Their evidence is terrible. Next, they say that it's true that government hates, but in which they won't just pass the budget reconciliation deal. No, our evidence postdates and says that it passes through now. Now.
Okay, this also, like, our evidence postdates and says it's passing through now, does not say it's passing through now, and postdates again by 1 day, which is pointed out earlier and kind of preempted already. Plus, it doesn't address the warrant. Like, the warrant says that the budget reconciliation is set to increase the deficit by $5.7 trillion. I think there might have been an attempted cross-application of the evidence in here that says like they're agreeing to make it budget neutral, but that's not what the evidence said, right? Like it said that there are some people in the Republican Party who want it to be budget neutral, and there are some people who don't want those kinds of steep cuts, which is certainly not evidence that says that the bill does not currently massively increase spending, which is a problem for lots of Republicans. So I don't think this is. I think that this work is pretty sloppy on the front lines. So I think that if Arman and Anuj pick up on this and extend the right responses, it could be quite damning for the politics argument. The rest of this is on the doc for the most part. There's one part where he responds to the weighing, like the probability stuff, and does time frame weighing. So I'll go back to the video for that. But for the rest of this rebuttal, I'll just look at the doc. Okay, here we are on the doc. So they start on the first contention. They have an indite, sort of a rehighlighting of the Livermore evidence. So Strake is green. They say addressing these issues requires increasing understanding of plutonium and other actinide science and tech. Um, I think that is not really like a good highlighting of this card because it says the technical basis for addressing these issues requires understanding plutonium. But there's like it doesn't say that plutonium is not understood. The way that I read this line in the card is like, in order to understand how to address these issues, we first need to understand how plutonium works. But I think people do understand how plutonium works. Like this looks like a rhetorical device in the evidence that is being used to frame the next part of the evidence, right? Like first we have to understand plutonium. Here's how plutonium works. Not like in order to solve the problem, we need to understand plutonium, which is like a nib that we don't have in the status quo. Like certainly scientists do understand plutonium and actinide science right now. It does say like increasing understanding. It requires increasing understanding, but it's unclear why increasing understanding is not happening in the status quo. So I think this is a decent indite, maybe, but I think it's like, I don't know. I would rate this as like a 3 out of 10 indite, probably not terminal. Then it says the link is wrong and sanctions check. Dartmouth says the link has been overstated. Countries already began seeking before nuclear energy. So suppliers require IAEA safeguards. Countries are wary of risking disruptions in supply. This is weird. This looks like a card that is responding to the neg nuclear prolif scenario, right? It says countries were seeking nuclear weapons before nuclear energy. So there's no connection between nuclear energy in a given country and that country seeking nuclear weapons. But this is just a no prolif card, right? I guess this is, to be fair, I guess this is no prolif against the impact, which is prolif. The impact scenario is prolif. So this is impact defense, I guess, not really link defense, um, which works. I guess this line is not important in this case, but this line could be. The sanctions jeopardize them if they do make nuclear weapons, so they won't make nuclear weapons. Um, which, like, fair enough. But it's definitely not link defense. The next one, no impact, empirics prove and counterbalancing solves. So this is interesting. Is interesting. I feel like they've only read no impact cards. This is a no impact card, no prolif. This is a, I guess this is like a no internal link card, right? This is a no impact card. That prolif doesn't really matter. It doesn't actually create wars. And this is just another rehighlighting of alt causes. So let's see. Biden administration. Oh yeah, this is what I was saying earlier when I was analyzing the AF constructive. It's just like there's a lot of alt causes for the decline in U.S. nuclear dominance, which is that's pretty damning. I think this is probably the weakest part of the argument. So this response I think is quite good, especially since it's a rehighlighting of the unique of the impact evidence from the AF. So this is pretty damning. I think the other stuff is like okay, generic like no impact stuff is easy enough to get around, especially with a little bit of nuancing that comes from the case. And I think this rehighlighting is also easy enough to get around. But this last one I think is quite damning. So that makes it difficult to go for this argument. I guess you could go for it as a scalar thing, right? Like you could be like, yes, there's a lot of reasons why we're behind in nuclear, but it's all scalar, right? Like the more we do, and maybe like this is the most important one. So like if we overcome this, it's easier to overcome the other ones, and then it's like likely that we'll be able to fix those other things. Um, if we look at these individually, like faulty electrical wiring, that seems like it can be fixed. Maybe by like a general practical solution. Who knows? This one says it was an unsuccessful test. Well, maybe it was unsuccessful because we didn't have plutonium pits that were good enough, or like, there's just other successful tests. Yeah, it says it's conducted several successful tests since then, so that seems fine. Biden decided to retire a lot of warheads, but okay, but Trump is probably going to bring them back, or like, there are other types of warheads. We don't need that particular warhead. We need like plutonium pits for all the other warheads. Um, okay. So the other problem with this though is that it is path dependent on beating the link on the defense acquisitions argument from the neg politics scenario. So they definitely uplayer you. Like that makes the weighing incredibly difficult. There is a little bit of uniqueness that could be cross applied here, but it's difficult, I think, to win weighing between this contention and neg C2. So I would say it's a good strategic decision not to go for C1 after this. What do they say on warming? First is the green paradox stuff, it looks like. They'll ramp up production of fossil fuels. We've already preempted this on Plano's side. I think that the preempt, again, from the other stuff was not very well handled. So I think that this cross applies very easily and neatly, and that prevents the only turn. I think it would have been more strategic from Strake to dump more link turns on the warming scenario, even if they're not very well developed link turns. I think having more offensive opportunities makes it easier to make it seem like the link on the scenario is not very good later in the round because like inherent in all link offense, like link turns, is also some link defense that is often stronger than just the impact defense they end up reading. And then this is like I think a lot of work on an argument that's already been preempted, right? Like there's two entire cards being read on Green Paradox, um, even though that you've already mishandled a response on Green Paradox. So I think if you're going to spend this much time on Green Paradox, you should maybe spend a little bit more time frontlining the response on it before you read this stuff, just from like a time trade-off standpoint. Next, there's this is like a little bit of a weird pre-fiat spike that seems like a bit of a trick that's designed to be dropped. Calling climate change existential is misleading. So this is both impact defense, like it's not existential, and also like technically like a little pre-fiat thing, like outweighs because fiat is illusory. Like maybe this is an IVI, like it is bad to call climate change existential. Um, I think it's a little bit cheeky, but I don't know. And then even if we cut all emissions immediately, it doesn't really matter. 90% of extra energy from warming is taken up by oceans. It will take 1,000 years for heat to mix. So there's a thermal lag. Even if we eliminate all emissions, oceans will still release the heat. Ice sheets will continue to melt. Temperature will only drop slightly. This is very good impact defense. And this is, again, a reason why I think it would have been strategic to read air pollution as well, especially if you're not going for magnitude weighing at the end of the round, or at least a diversified pool of different impact scenarios from warming. The next one is also quite good. No warming impact. Um, this evidence here, mortality has decreased from climate deaths by 98%, is pretty great. I don't know if there's a lot of problems with this card. I haven't read it very carefully. But it seems like adaptation is overcoming a lot of the deaths, which is good. Um, yeah, and it has responses to tipping points. It's very good. And then no warming impact again, or this is the same evidence again. It's just been pasted twice. Warming is survival and net beneficial. Nice. 4 degrees is not existential. Technically, the scenario in the app is 8 degrees, so maybe that sort of sneaks past this. Sea level rise is slow, etc. Extreme heat is not that bad. Um, the problem with a lot of the impact defense, though, is that a lot of it doesn't answer all of the list, like laundry list of internal links from the warming scenario. Like, for example, warming causes war. I think some of that is answered, but then like there's a bunch of other stuff that's not answered. So it's hard. It's kind of a game of whack-a-mole to try to answer every single possible terminal impact that stems off of warming. But I think if that game is winnable, then this is probably the best way to win it. I think the impact defense cards are quite good. So that makes it more difficult to go for warming. But the thing about warming is it's just true. Like all of this is definitely mitigation. Even like this weird like impact turn, like where even is the impact turn in this? Net beneficial. Uh, Humans can live well under conditions. Warming alleviates suffering from cold. Sure. I don't know that this like necessarily says that there's a net improvement from climate change. But I think all of this is very answerable by the litany of internal links that stem from warming and the empirical deaths that have come from warming, even if those are decreasing. Like certainly, I think there's good chances that they could increase in the future despite adaptation. And like the logical arguments are that warming seems like a quite bad thing, and like fossil fuels are bad. Um, but it would be, I think, smart to diversify the impacts from fossil fuels outside of just warming into things like air pollution or like fossil fuels cause econ decline or fossil fuels cause oil wars or something like that. Given that this case is predictable. But yeah, I think this is a very good rebuttal. Like this rebuttal is incredibly efficient, incredibly, I think strategic, and does a very good job of locking down a lot of different paths to the ballot. The last thing, there's two last things I want to talk about for this rebuttal. One is that, let's see, where is the card? This card is quite nice as well. It says that when you have war, it actually increases climate change. Let's see, where is it? Fossil fuels are not the only possible cause of climate catastrophe. For example, it could also be caused by nuclear war. There's no warrant highlighted, so but it's pretty good, I think, to have that because it allows you to say that our impact scenario comes first, or at the very least, we have a link into warming from nuclear war as well. That said, you have conceded two arguments against nuclear war. One says nuclear winter doesn't happen. Maybe that doesn't apply to this, but the other one says mutually assured destruction, which probably does apply to this. So it's very easy for Plano to say mutually assured destruction means no nuke war from either side, and prevent that link in. The other thing I want to talk about from the rebuttal is the one extempt part on the weighing. So I'll go to the recording now. So here's the extempt part against the weighing.
Hundreds of years, oceans will extinct, ice sheets will continue to melt off, to have to drop only slightly. We'll answer the probability argument right now. Winning an extinction scenario that happens first, or independent turn argument means there's no astronomy life is valuable, so we ought to preserve it as long as possible. If best case, in the process of stopping extinction, the act causes it to happen quicker, you should vote nay. The probability weighing is incoherent and inventions, as everyone has different perceptions of what is probable, so you should keep all the time frame. Next, no more. Okay, so there's basically two responses that he gives to the probability slash time frame stuff in the AF constructive. First, he says time frame comes first if we have like a turns case argument or a short circuit argument like extinction, because it means, if our argument triggers, then then the AF doesn't happen, right? Then the solvency doesn't happen. So clearly this comes first. A technical way to view this is like this is an internal link into probability, which would have been maybe nice for him to say. Like this means that their probability falls to zero if our argument is true. And then the second response that he gives is that probability is like interventionist because everyone has a different view of how probable a given thing is. It's like inherently subjective, and therefore we shouldn't use it. I think that this response is like it's okay, but in my mind, it's maybe not the truest response. Who cares if it's true? It exists in the round, but it also like the warrant that he's making is just different people have different conceptions of how probable something is.
which yes is probably true, but that doesn't mean that there's no way of comparing the probability of two different scenarios. Like even if different people have different conceptions of the probability of each one, they might have ways of agreeing upon which one is more probable than the other one. Plus, it seems like also true of probably other types of weighing. Like different people have different predictions about how much magnitude a given scenario will have. Even if you have a card that says like 100 million people will die, we don't know that for sure. And like maybe different people have different conceptions of how bad it is for 100 million people to die, compared to other impacts as well. Same thing for time frame, right? Like maybe different people have different predictions of how when the time frame of a certain argument will actually occur. I guess some of those things sort of go back to probability, but it still seems like probability is an inherently important thing. Um, in our conceptions of value. Like if we didn't care at all about probability, I think that we would make some very interesting decisions that probably would create a lot of negative utility in the world. Like if I didn't care at all about probability, then I would probably spend all of my money on like lottery tickets, right? And then go broke. Or I would never get a vaccine, right? Because there's a 100, if I guess that's the opposite, right? Like if I only cared about magnitude and I didn't care about probability, then I would never take a shower, for example, because I would like there's always a chance I could like slip and fall and die, which is the highest magnitude. And if I don't care about probability, then like I should only care about the magnitude of that worst case scenario. So this certainly creates like policy paralysis. Ooh, and this is an interesting thing because I know that Anuj says policy paralysis, I think in the next speech, which could be construed later in the round as a response to this. Like, no, we were saying that uh, excluding probability entirely causes policy paralysis, which means even if it is subjective, it's necessary that we make comparisons between subjective probabilities using whatever evidence exists in the round, which is empirics. And then Plano could construe it as like not necessarily dropped. But we'll see how the rest of the round goes. The last thing I want to say about this rebuttal, and also about Anusha's rebuttal, which comes right after, is I think they're both incredibly efficient. Like, really, really good job with efficiency. One of the ways that Jason accomplishes this is by saying the word and instead of like numbering the responses. Like every single response just comes directly after the next one, which makes it very difficult for the opponents to flow. It also probably makes it difficult for the judges to flow. The difference is the judges have the doc, so they can probably backfill the flow, which is a practice I actually think is quite bad because it encourages kind of like intentionally being more blippy and making it more difficult for the opponents to flow your arguments. But in the context of this round, I think that it works because he's clear enough and it allows him to pack in way more content into a very small amount of time. Okay, now let's talk about the pro rebuttal. First, what does Anuj need to do in this speech? I think first he has to punish a lot of the unintentional concessions from Jason's speech, because again, I think Jason was a little bit sloppy, especially on frontlining some of the surprise responses. He was incredibly efficient, but I think technically some of the front lines don't completely apply to the responses. Second, I think that Anuj can spam some extra responses to spread Daniel's first summary very thin. If he has to deal with both the responses from before that are defended pretty well and extra responses, it means he has a lot of work to do. And third, I think that, of course, he probably has to collapse on his own case because there's so much content from first rebuttal. Luckily, most of this is defensive content. So as long as he can pick like pretty strategically which contention to go for, I think this should be pretty easy. I think that he ends up making the right decision, which is to collapse on climate here, because I think that probably there's much more of an ability to weigh climate, especially given what I was saying earlier, that like the politics DA intuitively uplayers the link on C1 from the pro. And I think that this is one of the risks of breaking a new position in sort of late outs, as they hadn't practiced it very much. So it might be more difficult to intuitively frontline a lot of the good responses that Jason read. Okay, let's watch it and see how he does. Okay.
After one look at the app and saw the ability to start out that running from online classes that their impact here. That the ability to modernize these they can't they do not put they don't have impact not their impact on politics, on climate.
Okay, so this is pretty smart. What he's doing here is he's collapsing on C2 by conceding some of the defense on C1, but he's still keeping a spike that's inside of C1. That's the uniqueness cross applies to the C2 on the negative case. That is to say, the uniqueness of the C1 on the AF is saying that nuclear modernization is a failure. And so the military dominance and the hegemony of the US vis-a-vis China is on the decline, sort of terminally in the status quo. None of the responses that were read by the other side actually refute that uniqueness. And in fact, some of them sort of lock it in by, pointing out other alt causes for why that's happening in the SQO, which is cross-applied here against the impact uniqueness of the C2 on the negative, which is about, at least is tied into sort of the US military dominance and the ability to deter things like conflicts around the world. So I think this is an incredibly smart cross-application. This is something that Plano is really, really good at doing, is finding like little parts of contentions they don't want to go for that they can still cross-apply in other sneaky ways later in the round. And this makes like an extra bonus response on what Plano is smart in sort of predicting Strake will probably go for. And especially having a bonus response cross-applied from a separate part of the flow is often a place where the other team is usually going to make a mistake. I don't think Strake actually makes a mistake on it in this round. They're, very good at handling it, but it's a very sneaky and I think smart strategy here.
Every concept versus web production work right if the reduce the response from all the parties that work with the more likely to diversify to media and be itself because the ramp up production and working with really treats those less problems out there and sends back to diversify between the more ramp production and
again, the diversifying cross application here, I think is super smart. And we kind of saw this coming from before because it was intentionally tagged as a preempt to the green paradox response when it was first read in the second constructive.
You're already doing right now because they want from their one problem that's policies real problems that they don't have anything really to do it. They cannot walk from one way. Taking out the like NBC, you can do that time can all happen now with that. It's offering you real world change, they're offering you 50 that says we can't solve climate change solution. Right now it's possible progress. You can turn this to previous alternative because they're ready to bad they're ready to shouldn't do anything. Climate change doesn't cause extinction bad because they're probably justified not doing anything. We have more emissions that are bad with previous reasons.
So I think this is super sneaky. Like this is one of the things that separates these teams from some other really great teams, because I feel like most people would not think to do this, but instead of just reading some responses to the IVI, Anush just turns it. Like he just says, no, this is an IVI against you, which I think is incredibly smart. Another thing I want to note about this is like the IVI was read with a card, and Anush here, I don't think he reads any cards in this entire speech, including against the IVI. And yet it like really obviously, we'll see later in the round, does not matter like at all. So I think that there's something to be said for having the guts to like pull an offensive maneuver like this that most people wouldn't think about. Like I think most people would feel very defensively inclined against an IVI like this, and you maybe read some framework arguments that are like, don't evaluate it or don't drop the debater. But instead he goes for just like a turn like no you, which I think is incredibly smart, just like, on the line by line without even any hesitation.
All this right now, there's a normalized service doesn't make sense. It's not just about the rising income. There's just going off into the positive, which we it needs to be our everything goes for one creation, right? So 150 million that this is no warming time 50 hours every historical math change because of climate change, so you can't get done that factor, or you just come to increase the stuff only one off like not like climate change also rise maybe like isolated things out of these things is I have to believe with market and the company not to respect that in the long term. Last one thing is that we're able to make it, what just a potential that the potential to have another reason technology too. I think that was developed countries still have impact people dying from talking about like on people the reason why I thought this is why I think this is forcing a greater effect on like everything 40 degrees not post next because they're arguing all that the warming stuff having to that country is not increasing temperature all conflict around and then and on top of that, and even just like a 0.1 degree Celsius causes 150 million people die. So even if you don't have a 4 degree Celsius, still
There's a little bit of redundancy here. I think he gets inefficient toward the end of frontlining. You could see that Armand like kind of looks up at him. I think that this is warranted because he's starting to repeat himself a lot from like, for example, extending this card about 0.1 degrees Celsius causes 100 million deaths over and over again, and like the other effects of warming like pandemics. So there could be an improvement in the efficiency if you just group some of these things better. But I think the strategy with frontlines here is very smart. And this shows some of the versatility of the warming scenario that they're dealing with in the first place, is he's able to sort of concede a lot of the cards that Jason read in the rebuttal and say like all of that is just about heat or about other specific impacts from climate change. But we read a whole laundry list, and there's lots of parts of the laundry list that maybe don't depend on heat and aren't actually responded to by a lot of the specific warrants in the impact defense cards. And this is part of the problem with reading impact defense against a laundry list of internal links from the warming scenario, is that unless you attack like the very first link that's upstream of all of the laundry list, it's kind of playing a game of whack-a-mole, and you have to get really lucky for your evidence to be specific enough to answer all of the specific scenarios that are being read in the impact of the affirmative constructive, which doesn't end up happening in this round. For example, Anuja is right that there's no specific defense on the pandemic's internal link from the warming scenario. I am a little bit suspicious about this idea that like there's something about the impact of climate change that is separate from heat, which is a premise that is relied upon by a lot of these front lines, right? Like, oh, their evidence is just about how the earth gets hotter, but that's not all what our impact scenario is about. So they don't control for other effects. But my reading of the original like impact scenario evidence from the AF is that it all sort of does depend on the warming of the planet, right? Like, why do pandemics happen? It's because different places get warmer and maybe they become havens for more mosquito populations, which spread new kinds of diseases, or like there's ancient pathogens in the Arctic that get thawed out because of warming, because the Earth gets hotter. And so I think some of the arguments, like, for example, this inevitability of warming into the future from like the ocean thermal lag, like that probably still applies to almost all of the impact scenario, which is why I think the AF would have been better served reading explicitly different kinds of impacts from climate change that are not just related to global warming, things like air pollution from fossil fuels, or just other impact scenarios from climate change in general, like instability of different environments, regardless of their temperature per se, I think would be very smart. Like coral bleaching, for example, coral bleaching just comes from CO2 emissions, creating like carbonic acid when they react with water in the ocean. That isn't really about heat necessarily, although heat might be an extra link into that, which would have been better diversified scenarios to escape some of the impact defense. But I think in this round, it kind of gets away unnoticed. Although this is something that I think Strake should take advantage of in the next few speeches, is that technically this is a little bit sloppy on the impact defense. Although he does have good empirics at the very least, which might imply that the impact defense is not terminal, right? Like every past extinction has been, or like, yeah, every past extinction has been empirically caused by climate change, empirically causes millions of deaths, etc. Those empirics might at least prove that there is an impact despite the impact defense, even if that impact isn't existential.
On the impact of the seriously impact defense just now, they say they should also take care of the public safety economy climate. This is so marvelous. Why would they turn to more public alternates? There are a million other things they could do. We could invest in welfare stuff to do all those things people more happier private safety economy, which is the reason why we made economy doesn't make more economic less likely because of the fact that you're an economic crisis capability.
This is super smart here. I think he's incredibly good at the logic here. One problem is that he technically has conceded like prefer statistical evidence on this question, and he doesn't present any statistical evidence on the question. So even if he's ahead on the warrant level on the impact defense, he might be behind on the evidence, the empirical level. That said, he does, like, I don't know if you catch it, but there's a blip at the end of this extension that actually happens to be an extra response that's like an impact turn that is, if anything, a economic decline actually reduces the capacity for states to go to war because they have less money to fund war. Again, I don't know if this overcomes the empirical analysis. There's a higher chance of war probably accounting for this, but it's still like a really sneaky warrant to throw in there. And this is one of the things that I think makes Anuja's rebuttals so deadly, is there are just like so many independent analytics that have often very huge implications that can get blown up later in the round, but are very difficult to catch because they're all mostly off of the dome. Like, this year, for example, he is part of the US World Schools team. So he's only developed further that ability to come up with really strategic responses very quickly without writing any of them down, without a doc or anything, which becomes very difficult for the other team to flow without a doc. And also allows him to get away with lots and lots of dropped responses at the end that he can sort of play around with.
probably good thing. All on the proper one. They're transferring 5 to the EFA was working the past one down now it's going to decline some number two models or voice pop.com as much as better or things will now have to do other things for on your three because AI will probably come better if they want to YouTube just post some more come along and do not that it's now for mana and so the active type cycles are in that which aids on nuclear obviously you can see the bubble plus the bubble pop out and anything why economics is such a good for why. Almost about politics. One, you'll go to the first
That was a really, really efficient spam. Like this is exactly the kind of thing that I was just talking about. An example of, I think there were like literally like 7 responses in there, and he just gets through them so quickly. And again, he's using the same sort of strategy for efficiency that Jason was using, but maybe even at a new level at this point, where he like doesn't really number these responses. It's the transition is very seamless from one response to another. Maybe it's the word and or nothing at all. And that makes it even more deadly. Although, again, this could pose some problems with the judges. But at this point, I think most of the strategic value of spamming all of these responses is probably to dissuade Strake from going for this. I feel like Plano at this point probably has an intuitive sense that Strake wants to go for C2 or C3. And so they're just locking in that decision by putting enough ink on C1 to dissuade Strake from going for it.
There's no going back. Just diversifying nuclear energy. That is that is the response that already extended. Second thing we'll go for that nuclear lobbying is increasing right now. They just said oil lobby so dominant. Our evidence is the projected trying to think that nuclear lobbying rise. We don't have to. We don't have to go to like the oil lobbies itself. Politicians Western politicians don't actually face backlash. And third, we'll go for the warrant that the bill will pass. They just need to pass it now. They can see the warrant that if they're correct, that the government still want out of it. The Republicans don't want to help them, then that's the bad thing too. The bill itself is spending in itself. Okay.
I think here on C2 is where Anuj makes a bit of a strategic mistake. It clearly from round vision, we can tell that Strake probably wants to go for this contention, so it's better to focus more time here. I think the time should have been spent more giving new responses. You can tell there is 0 new responses on C2 in this speech. It's only defending some of the previous responses from second constructive, but I also don't think that he does that super well. Like it's not super clean. For example, he says, our evidence about the nuclear lobby increasing was a trend. And that's true, but Strake conceded that. The whole point is that it's a rising trend into the future, but it won't apply to this specific link scenario that happens next month or whatever. And so I think this kind of stuff is a little bit sloppy and could have had the potential to be much more damning, because I think there are a lot of pieces of these responses that were conceded by Strake, conceded by Jason in the last speech that could have been pointed out much more cleanly to make sure that the judges understand that these are really like damningly dropped responses. One thing also that I think is problematic is that he drops like one of the only front lines that was actually applicable from Jason's rebuttal, which was like the oil lobby is still high now. Technically, the oil diversification argument takes this out because it's implicated to saying that there won't be any backlash, which is why it would link into the scenario in the first place by controlling Republicans' pockets. But I think that requires an extra step, and it just would have been nice to have a clean piece of defense that doesn't require winning the oil diversification argument as well, which, the indite on it is also dropped. I don't think the indite is very good. The indite I'm referring to is the argument that Jason read that said that the evidence about diversification was only about 3 oil companies. It's dropped, but it's like, who cares if it's dropped? Like, who cares if it's 3 oil companies? The warrant from the card is also dropped. But I think that could have at least been pointed out. And the fact that it wasn't is, I feel like, a little bit sloppy and leaves open too much room for Strake to go for politics, when I think this speech could have just closed the door if it was a little bit more effective here.
One, they were all emphasis on the politics of that code. The government doesn't nothing they incentive to make sure work for the money. They looked at and saw all the reasons why Trump's out of for and they say
I think this is the smartest response in this speech. This is exactly what you need to do against a contention that is just like a list of 8 reasons why implementation fails, is you just need an overview response that says, even if they win any of these reasons, they're not terminal. You need that. And I think he executes this very well. It's incredibly efficient. He gives good reasoning as to why it's true. Like we've seen projects be successful in the past. None of these apply to every single project. I think this is just the response that you absolutely need every single time against an argument that is intended to be filled with terminal spikes against your case. You just need to be like, look, maybe some of these are true. None of them are actually terminal. And this is something you can defend later in the round, which ensures that you haven't technically dropped any of them, even if you don't have extra words on a specific one later on in the flow.
happen in 12 months, and this is definitely not terminal because before you got to their after you right now, you can understand what they say, and not just one person.
The 40 reactors empiric is also incredibly smart here. This is like empirical proof. I guess it's technically a thumper on all of the other arguments, or I don't know if you can consider it a thumper because the arguments are kind of defensive, but it's a really good response that empirically proves that none of these have been terminal in the past. So the only ones I can go for are the ones that are unique to specifically right now or specifically in the future.
The markets and all actually giving more money to fuel the loss. They take time to be energy, they out of markets that we recycle waste to work down all the same incentive, but it takes us responsible to matter because if the product is not to you're not in contact with the future and when for the check back, but they're having a propaganda or it's not education, why you do it, so it's not to get
He's so efficient here. Like, it's honestly incredible that he's able to make independent responses to all 5 of the different spikes in here. Granted, he doesn't make independent responses to each of the 4 that are embedded inside of the last one about incentives, but he doesn't really need to. He has an overview response both to all 5 and an overview response to that incentives argument itself, which means there are technically 2 responses on the flow that can be cross-applied to any of the different 4 subpoints within it. So I think this is, like, all things considered, given the amount of time he has and the amount of stuff he had to do in 4 minutes, it is incredible that he was able to get stuff out, like comprehensive and coherent responses against every single independent specific link here. So really props to him. So let's look at what the actual flow looks like at this point in the round. So here's what my flow looks like at this point in the round. This is on the negative constructive. We've got these responses from the pro-constructive. And you can see that, like, the first 3 front lines from Jason, which were hyper efficient, were all just sort of dropped here. So I think that is pretty bad for Plano. So here's what my flow looks like after both rebuttal speeches have ended. This is on the negative constructive, just to orient you. This is the AF constructive because it gave some surprise responses at the end. Here's the first rebuttal that gave some front lines against all of those responses, and then the second rebuttal. So that's why it looks a little bit weird that we have, like, these new answers on the 4th line of the flow. Technically, it's fine under existing PF norms as long as you accept that the second rebuttal is allowed to give new responses to the first constructive, which most people do. So here you can see, I think, some of the mistakes that were made in the second rebuttal. It was spread very thin. So, for example, it attempts to extend this no impact response, but it concedes 3 of the front lines. To be fair, these are very blippy front lines, but they are conceded. I think the third one is probably the most important that is conceded. Like, even if this response and the first new response that's given, which are both impact defense, even if they are theoretically true at the warrant level, as long as there is a warrant on the other side, the empirics is the thing that should break the clash there. And the statistics are only on the side of the AI bubble, yes, causing war. So econ decline probably does cause war in the context of this debate. But look at this. There's like 5 extra responses on top of that new impact defense that are given in just like a spam, which is, I think it was just like a 30-second just analytics spam, which is very, very effective. Some of these, to be fair, I think are slight misunderstandings of the original link chain of the AI bubble argument. But to be fair, I think Strake also misunderstood some of the responses, which might have been a reason why they didn't go for this kind of stuff. The next argument was about politics. Again, I think that this was a bit of a mistake not to add extra responses here. And you can see the front, they're like the backlining on these responses is a little bit sloppy. And then finally, we have all of these new responses against the implementation contention, which I think was incredibly effective, especially, again, like these first few responses that can be grouped, the 40 new reactors being built now, and all of the success in the past, and the general warrant that, like, politicians will stake their political legacies on this. That said, there could be some cross applications that could happen from Strake later in the round. For example, like the fact that response 2 here is dropped. You could pretend that this response originally was that Trump is irrational, which could cross apply here on the flow. Maybe like Trump irrational conceded means that this response goes away. I'm not convinced it completely goes away, but I think, again, this response here is probably the most important response in this entire rebuttal. Like, none of this stuff is terminal, probably applies to almost everything here. And that was really smart. Plus the cross application of, like, the conceded part of the AF case that the waste is recycled to the Texas versus NRC case. Super smart. I don't know if it 100% applies, but super smart application in this round. On the pro-constructive, you can see exactly what happened here with the sort of extension of just the uniqueness into I guess this is actually the probe rebuttal, not the summary. So I should change that. And then all of the front lines on here, you can see some of the redundancy here as well, where he extends some of the same evidence a bunch, like this 0.1 to 100 million and the pandemic stuff, and like the claim that it's not all about warming, I think was said like 3 times in the rebuttal. So that could have been grouped, which would have made it much more efficient. But in general, I think these front lines are incredibly good, and he's very creative at getting out a lot of this very good evidence that's been read by Strake. Some of the things I think he could have done better. I think there are broadly like four. One is a little bit sneaky, and this is not necessarily something that I would encourage everyone to do, but I'll just explain a little bit of an experimental strategy that you could use, which is threatening a collapse on the argument you don't intend to go for. This is just to spread the first summary much more thin. If you're able to do it with a good time trade-off, then it's super effective in the round because it sort of makes them paranoid and forces them to extend some defense, which eats up their time in first summary. So the way that I would do this in this round, for example, is maybe we would say indict not terminal and sanctions don't apply to rogue states. And this empiric is incomplete. I think it was only about a few countries. And existential threat outweighs balancing, and it's scalar, so the all causes don't matter. So I think you could do this in less than 10 seconds, literally. Like, let's see. If I'm pretending to start Anusha's rebuttal, I could say, on C1, indict is not terminal, and sanctions don't apply to rogue states, and their empirics are incomplete, and existential threat warrant outweighs balancing, and it's scalar, so the all causes don't matter. Like, that's 8 seconds max. Then you go to, I mean, maybe you could spend extra time, again, extending this uniqueness, but it's sort of funny because it creates a massive time suck for the first summary, which could be pretty devastating for them. At the very least, it forces them to extend a response that they don't want to extend and they wouldn't otherwise have to. And spending 8 seconds of second rebuttal time to force first summary to like extend a whole response is a pretty positive time trade-off in most cases for the second speaking team. The second thing that I think you could have done better is like there are a decent amount of drops. You can see I listed them all out here. And I think Straight could use each of them to different strategic effects. So for example, this one probably doesn't matter that much. Warming reduces cold suffering. Like, who cares? We probably outweigh because that's not really much of a terminalized impact, but it is conceded. It's like extra impact defense. Maybe we technically respond by saying that it's not all about warming, but still, this is technically an impact turn. It just doesn't outweigh. The next response that was conceded is about time frame and extinction comes first. This is a big part of the rebuttal that I think was a big problem, is that all of this weighing stuff is just dropped. I think this demonstrates a lack of like a bit of short-sightedness on the round vision and weighing specifically. And this comes from the fact that I think Plano these days in tech rounds is very used to winning on like terminal defense plus risk of offense. And so that's a bit of a bad habit demonstrated here. I think that second rebuttal could have been way more ahead on a coherent weighing strategy going into the rest of the round, but just sort of gave it up, unfortunately. Technically, this is still winnable. Like some of the stuff from constructive could be cross-applied to get around some of these responses, but it's unfortunate that they are technically conceded on the flow as claims. At the very least, in terms of judge psychology, it makes it harder to convince the judges that you're ahead on the weighing debate later in the round. The next thing that's conceded is all of the stuff here. I don't think this matters actually that much because we have this whole spam later. But yeah, it is possible. The door is still open technically for Straight to go for the AI bubble argument as well, because these are all conceded. And again, this second one might be able to cross apply later on the flow on C2 as well, which would be problematic for Plano's main defensive pushes. The next ones. Oh yeah, I talked earlier about how Strake C1 technically could be cross-applied in a lot of different ways defensively to the pro case. For example, the fact that energy efficiency is going to rise in the future maybe means that there's a non-unique solvency for the warming problem. Also, more importantly, the fact that AI bubble or specifically nuclear energy being a bubble in the market inevitably is conceded explicitly and even given extra all causes means that Strake could try to pull the same maneuver that Plano is pulling with the kind of uniqueness only extension and cross applying it to the link on the other side, but probably much more effectively. If Strake, for example, in first summary is able to extend like you have conceded that nuclear energy will have a bubble that will inevitably pop and collapse the nuclear sector, then I think it's almost impossible for Plano to win any kind of material solvency on warming, at least in long term, which makes it very effective for Strake to claim that they at least have like 99% mitigation on that link. The oil lobby dominates now stuff. I talked about this already, is probably combined with the next part, is probably like it leaves the door open too much on the politics scenario, which wasn't necessary. Plus this whole like, I think maybe the biggest thing is also, I think Anuj is letting Straight get away with too much on a little bit of a generous interpretation of their uniqueness evidence on the politics stuff. Especially here, like I think Jason technically says like, no, it won't increase the deficit. Our evidence says it will keep it neutral or decrease the deficit, which is just certainly not in the card. Like this is like an egregiously bad interpretation of the evidence. And I think that Anu should not let them get away with this. But he kind of does, unfortunately. So those are some of the things I think Anuj could have done better. But overall, I think this is an incredibly good speech for the position that they're in. And if it had done a little bit more on the weighing, I think it could be much more ahead. But I think it hypothetically still could have a good chance with some of the defense on politics, assuming Straight goes for it. There's one more potential concession I wanted to point out that I missed on my first go through of the second rebuttal, which is that technically there is a capacity warrant in the third contention in the neg. It's like hidden in there, but it says independently in one of the cards that like the US is out of manufacturing capacity and heavy forging that presumably nuclear energy expansion would require. So this could also be construed as terminal defense by Strake and was technically never touched by Anuj because he only answered the incentive arguments that it was hidden within. So one viable path potentially for first summary is to be like, you have conceded there is no industrial capacity for the expansion of nuclear energy, period, because the US has lost its manufacturing base. That means your solvency is impossible, but we still have the political controversy involved. So there's only a link to politics, and the climate solvency is like zero, or at least close to zero. Like you could even if this is mitigatory, it's still heavy mitigation, which means that it's pretty unreasonable to assume that the app has a very high chance of solving any reasonable degree of warming. This could be really interesting as a strategy as well. So I think that one thing that happened in this round is not that. So it seems like this was a sort of a new position that Strake was reading that was mostly cut by Ishan. So maybe they didn't know how to use all of the specific interactions in the cards. The summary that Daniel did end up giving, which we'll see in the next video, was still superb. I think it's probably the best speech in the round. But technically, there is more that was left on the table that could have been used to really put the nail in the coffin. So just wanted to mention that. But stay tuned for the next video, which will probably drop tomorrow, which will be the back half of the round. I haven't recorded it all yet, so depending on how long it is, I might also separate summary and final focus. But hopefully, I'm able to keep it concise enough to include them both together. So stay tuned for that. See you later.